So we have 30 cherries, and one way to get maximum flavor out of them is actually to ferment them in a vacuum sealed bag. Delicious flavor, and the process is super easy. So to start, rinse off cherries under cold running water, let them air dry. With a very sharp paring knife, very carefully cut the cherry in half, separate those two hemispheres, exposing the pit. Now, one cool way to get that pit out is actually using tomato shark, which I'm showing you right here. This is such a handy kitchen tool. I'll leave a link in the description if you want to grab one. Using that tomato shark, carefully use the teeth on it and grab a hold of that pit and yank it right out of there. This is a little bit of a process trying to get those cherry pits out of it, but trust me, using fresh cherries, fermenting them, and using them in the barbecue sauce is an absolute game changer. You'll also need a kitchen scale, so I place a mixing bowl onto the kitchen scale that's set to read grams, zero it out, place the cherries into the bowl. Now take very careful note of that weight, which is 210 grams, and we're going to multiply that by 2.5%. So put 210 into your calculator, multiply that by 0.025, 5.25 grams. Now this is the amount of salt that we need for the fermentation process. The salt is very important when you're doing this. You want to use fine sea salt that is non-iodized, and the ingredients listed should only be salt. No preservatives, no anti-caking agents, no other BS. Now we take a small ramekin, place it onto the scale, zero it out, and place the amount of fine sea salt that we calculated. Now my digital scale does not read in grams, so I round to the next whole number. Take that calculated amount of fine sea salt, sprinkle it over the cherries, carefully mix it to evenly distribute. It's very important that you cover all the cherries completely with all that salt. Now we need to move on to the next process, which is placing these cherries into a vacuum sealed bag. I'm using my vacuum sealer and sealing one end. I like to seal it twice because as these cherries ferment, the bag's gonna inflate, ballooning up, and this gives you a double protection layer that you don't have any of that gas escape from the bag. Carefully place the cherries into that bag, and now the next thing that you want to do is make sure that you lay all these cherries flat. You want to make sure none of them are overlapping. Carefully with your hand, just evenly spread them out. I love the taste of fresh tarragon and cherries. There is such a beautiful flavor combination and just adds a fantastic flavor for when we go to make our barbecue sauce. Next step is to vacuum seal the bag. Super easy process, and that is pretty much all you need to do to this. Let them sit out at room temperature away from direct sunlight. I have a place in my pantry that I keep all my fermentation projects at. I let these ferment for about 10 days. You could go in the range of 7 to 10 days. Now after day 4, on the left you could see that vacuum bag has ballooned up quite nicely. The cherries are starting to release a lot of their good juices, which is a very good sign, and the ballooning of the bag is a great sign that the fermentation process is occurring. You definitely need to leave enough headspace in the bag so that you could cut the top of it off, release some of that gas, and then seal it up again and let them ferment for another 3 to 5 days. After the time frame is up, cut the bag open and place all the juices with the cherries into a mixing bowl. Now, if we weren't making a barbecue sauce, that juice that the cherries release makes a great base for a vinaigrette. You could drizzle it over fish. These cherries are fantastic all by themselves. They have a little bit of hint of saltiness to them. They have a nice fermented flavor to them. They're delicious. Now moving on to the barbecue sauce part, we have cherry coke, naturally. We have a handful of spices, tomato paste, honey, basil. To start, a stock pot that's going to be big enough to hold the entire 2-liter bottle of the coke, plus the rest of the ingredients. Now for the spices, we're going to put in half of a teaspoon anise, half of a teaspoon cumin, 1 tablespoon chili powder, 2 teaspoons coriander, 1 teaspoon each onion and garlic powder, 2 tablespoons white distilled vinegar for the last ingredient that I'm going to put in at this point in time. The vinegar is going to make this bubble up a little bit, so don't be alarmed. Perfectly normal, perfectly okay. Put the stock pot over medium-high heat and set the rest of the ingredients aside. That's going to be honey, tomato paste, and some basil. Bring this coke up to a boil, reduce the heat to medium-low, and keep it at a low simmer. I add the cherries in at this point in time. If you're worried about keeping that bacteria alive, go ahead and skip the cooking process on this part and just add the cherries at the very end when the barbecue sauce is completely cooled. Put the tomato paste in when this is obviously starting to reduce. You could put the tomato paste in whenever you want. I just choose to do it when it's starting to reduce and I know the liquid is hot and the tomato paste is going to dissolve completely. Mix in the tomato paste, add the honey, and continue simmering this sauce for about 30 to 45 minutes. You really want this to reduce to about 2 cups, so that is a beautiful barbecue sauce consistency. I mean, the thicker you want it, the longer you're gonna simmer it. If you want it thinner, simmer it less time. First, a cracked black pepper goes in. That was about 10 turns worth on my pepper mill. I have a spot on my stock pot that will tell me when a liquid is reduced to about 2 cups. Alternatively, pour it into a liquid glass measuring cup, see where you're at. Put it back on heat if you need to reduce it more. Off the heat, I drop the basil in and let that basil steep in that barbecue sauce as it cools for about 20 minutes, giving this sauce a beautiful flavor. All these flavors work incredibly well together. We have tarragon, we have cumin, we have anise seeds, we have all those spices that have been carefully selected for the barbecue sauce. Has a great consistency. Like I said, if you want it thicker, simmer it longer, thinner, simmer it less. Give the barbecue sauce a taste, season it as necessary, add in more salt, add in more freshly cracked black pepper. I like to stir in the basil a little bit after about 10 minutes, give it a final taste, see where all the flavors are at. Once the barbecue sauce is cooled for about 20 minutes, remove the basil and I pour the barbecue sauce into a mason jar and just reserve it for later use. Moving on to the next part, which we need to get our ribs ready to cook. I have a homemade smoked paprika seasoned salt recipe, link will be in the description. Heavily coat the ribs with this seasoned salt, all sides. Don't forget any kind of corners, any kind of flaps that the ribs may have. Everything needs to be seasoned with this beautiful smoked paprika seasoned salt. Once you're happy with the amount of salt on there, gently pat the seasoned salt into the ribs. And now we're going to set this into the oven to high broil setting. Broil each side of the ribs for about 5 to 10 minutes each. You definitely want to keep an eye on them. We're only looking for a slight browning, slight caramelization on the ribs. Not really looking to fully cook the ribs at this point in time. And the spices will generally burn. These ribs are going to be braised, so in order to start that process, I'm taking 1 head of garlic and quartering it. I'm not even worrying about removing any kind of outer papery layer. 1 yellow sweet onion that's going to get cut into 6 pieces. We have 3 whole carrots. Cut the ends off, cut the carrots in half, and then cut those halves in half lengthwise. No peeling of the carrots is required. In a glass Pyrex dish, I place the carrots cut side down, arranging them evenly. Onions are going to get distributed somewhat randomly, as well as the garlic. I'm not removing any kind of paper layer on the onions or the garlic, as this is just for a place for the ribs to sit on, and it's kind of flavor the ribs as they cook. Fresh herbs, that's tarragon, rosemary, thyme. Place the ribs on top of the vegetables and the herbs. I warmed up 2 cups of beef stock and I'm pouring it into the glass Pyrex dish. That's just enough braising liquid to cover the vegetables. Heating up the braising liquid is important to help speed up the cooking process. Cover the dish up with some tin foil. Place it in the oven that's been preheated to 275 degrees, and that's going to go for 2 hours. After the 2 hours is up, remove the tin foil, and now we're going to place about a cup's worth of that cherry coke barbecue sauce that we made with those Lacto cherries directly on top of the ribs. Place back in the oven, uncovered, for 1 more hour. Keep a close eye on it after about 45 minutes to ensure that that barbecue sauce isn't starting to burn. We want this barbecue sauce to caramelize, not burn. Allow the ribs to rest for about 20 minutes before cutting and serving. And of course you want to serve it with a side dish of that beautiful homemade cherry coke barbecue sauce. These ribs are incredibly flavorful, incredibly tender, and that barbecue sauce is top notch.